we're doing this on a Sunday instead of Monday because I work tomorrow. So, but we'll go back to regular schedule next week. So, final part of part 5 of my reading. 8th book of the Gallic Wars. Do I have the info right? Just double check. Yep, alright. Let's go. The 8th book by Aulus Hirtius, 51 BC, AUC 703, Consuls Servius, Sulpicius, Rufus, and Marcus Claudius Marcellus. The final pacification of Gaul, preparations for civil war. Alright. Let me turn that off there. Alright. Don't think I need that on. Alright. Dear Balbus, to prevent my daily refusal appearing more like an excuse for avoiding effort than a plea for pardon on grounds of difficulty, I have, at your continual prompting, undertaken an extremely difficult task. Because of the gap which existed between his earlier and later writings, I have composed a continuation of our friend Caesar's commentaries on his campaigns in Gaul. His latter work, which was unfinished, I have completed from the operations at Alexandria right up to the end. Not the end of civil strife, for the conclusion of that is not in sight, but the end of Caesar's life. I am now anxious that any who read my work should understand how reluctantly I undertook to write it. This will absolve me more effectively of the charge of arrogant folly in intruding myself into the midst of Caesar's writings. After all, there is general agreement that however carefully other writers have completed their work, the refinement of these commentaries is by far superior. They were published to prevent writers from lacking accurate information on such important events, but they have won such universal acclaim that, rather than gaining a subject, the same writers seem to have been robbed of one. Even so, my admiration of this achievement is greater than others, for everyone else knows how well and faultlessly he composed, but I also know how easily and swiftly he completed the commentaries. For Caesar possessed not only considerable fluency and refinement in his writing, but also extremely precise expertise in setting out his own intentions. As for me, it never chanced that I was involved in the Alexandrian and African wars. I learned something of these campaigns from conversation with Caesar, but we listen in one way to events which strike us as remarkable or unprecedented, and in quite another to facts we must then set down as evidence. Doubtless, as I am amassing all these reasons and excuses to avoid being compared with Caesar, I am subject to accusations of arrogance all the same, on the grounds that I think anyone could consider me on a level with Caesar. Farewell. 1. The whole of Gaul was now conquered. There had been no break in campaigning since the previous summer, and Caesar wanted the soldiers to have a time of rest and refreshment in winter quarters after their strenuous efforts. But at the same time, a number of Gallic states were reported to be renewing hostilities and hatching plots. The most likely reason suggested for this was that the Gauls had realized it was impossible for them all to stand together against the Romans in one place. But if a number of states went on the offensive at the same time in different places, the army of the Roman people would not have sufficient reinforcements or time or men to respond to them all. It would be wrong for any state to refuse to incur harm if the respite afforded by its fate enabled the rest to win back their liberty. 2. To prevent the Gauls being confirmed in this belief, Caesar put his quaestor Mark Antony in charge of his own winter camp while he himself set out from Bibracte on 31st December. Together with a cavalry guard, he made his way to the 13th Legion, which he had posted close to Aeduan territory in the land of the Bituriges. To it he added the 11th, which had been stationed close by. He left 2 cohorts to protect the heavy baggage and led the rest of the army to the country of the Bituriges, which is extremely fertile. With their wide territories and numerous towns, the Bituriges had proved too much for a single legion in winter quarters to control and prevent from starting war or hatching plots. Excuse me. 3. What happened when Caesar suddenly arrived was inevitable, given that the Bituriges were scattered and unprepared. Free from any apprehension, they were working in the fields, and the cavalry attacked them before they could flee to the towns for refuge. For Caesar had given orders that the usual signal of enemy invasion, generally marked by the burning of buildings, was to be omitted. This would prevent shortages of corn and fodder if he wished to advance further, and would also stop the enemy being panicked by the burning. Many thousands were taken prisoner, and the Bituriges were so frightened that those who had managed to evade the Romans on their arrival had fled to neighboring states. These refugees were depending on individual friendships or on their common partnership strategy, to no avail, for Caesar arrived everywhere by forced marches and gave none of the states an opportunity to take thought for another's safety rather than its own. This speed of action ensured that friendly peoples remained so, and it frightened waverers into coming to terms. The Bituriges realized that Caesar's clemency opened up a way for them to return to his friendship, and that the neighboring states had given hostages and been received back into friendship without suffering punishment. When offered the same terms, they did likewise. 4. The soldiers had eagerly persisted with their duties during the winter time, and during extremely difficult marches in unbearable cold. As a reward for their toil and endurance, Caesar promised to each man 200 sesterces, and as many thousand to the centurions, instead of booty. He sent the legions back to their winter camp, and himself returned to Bibracte on the 40th day. While he was there dispensing justices, the Bituriges sent him envoys to seek reinforcements against the Carnutes who, they complained, had launched an attack upon them. Caesar had spent no more than 18 days in camp, but on hearing this he took the 14th and 6th legions out of their winter quarters on the Saône. It was explained in the previous commentary that he had posted them there to arrange a supply of corn, so he set out to pursue the Carnutes with 2 legions. When the news of this force reached the Carnutes, they remembered the disaster which had befallen others, so they abandoned their villages and towns, where they were living in inadequate shelters built to meet their immediate need by making the winter bearable. After their recent defeat, they had left a number of their towns. Then they fled in all directions. Caesar did not want his soldiers exposed to the storms which were breaking out with particular ferocity at that time, so he pitched camp at Cenabum, a town of the Carnutes. He housed the soldiers partly in Gallic dwellings, partly in shelters made from tents hastily covered with thatch. Even so, he sent out cavalry and auxiliaries in every direction, where the enemy was rumored to have gone, and with good results, for most of our men returned loaded with booty they had seized. Because of the severe winter and their fear of imminent threat, the Carnutes were under pressure, driven from their homes, no longer daring to remain in one place for any length of time, unable to conceal themselves under the protection of the forest because of the fierce storms. They dispersed and scattered to neighboring states with the loss of a large part of their population. 6. This was the hardest time of year. Caesar therefore thought it sufficient to break up the forces which were assembling in order to prevent any outbreak of hostilities. As far as he could judge, it seemed improbable that there would be any opportunity now for a war of much importance. He posted Gaius Trebonius and 2 legions, which he had with him, to winter quarters at Cenabum. He himself learned from numerous embassies of the Remi and the Bellovaci, a people outstanding among all the Gauls and Belgic peoples for their excellent record in war, and their neighbors were preparing an army for muster at a single location under the leadership of Corius of the Bellovaci and Commius the Atrebatian. Their intention was to launch an attack in full force on the borders of the Suessones, a people who paid tribute to the Remi. Caesar judged it crucial not only to his prestige, but also to his safety to prevent any harm being done to allies who had served the Republic well. So he recalled the 11th Legion from winter quarters and sent a letter to Gaius Fabius, telling him to bring his 2 legions to the territory of the Saxones. He also summoned one of Titus Labienus's 2 legions. In this way, as far as the arrangement of winter quarters and the strategic demands of war allowed, with unremitting effort on his part, Caesar imposed the burden of operations on different legions in turn. 7. Once he had gathered his army, he set out against the Bellovaci. He pitched camp in their territory and sent out cavalry squadrons in all directions to take prisoners from whom he could find out the enemy's strategy. The cavalry carried out their orders and reported back that they had found very few men in the buildings, and even there had not remained behind to farm the land, for everywhere the evacuation had been thorough, but had been sent back as spies. When Caesar asked these prisoners where the host of the Bellovaci was and what were their intentions, he discovered that all the Bellovaci capable of bearing arms had met in a single place, and with them the Ambiani, Alarici, Caleti, Veliocasus, and Atrobates, also that they had selected a spot on high wooded ground surrounded by a marsh for their camp, and had transferred all their heavy baggage into the depths of the forest. Their campaign had a number of ringleaders, but the army gave special place to Curius, realizing that his hatred of the name of the Roman people was fiercest. A few days before the prisoners went on, Commius the Atrebatian had departed from the camp to win reinforcements from the Germans, who were not only close at hand, but also possessed of immense numbers of men. With the unanimous agreement of the leaders and eager assent from the people, the Bellovaci had decided that if, as was rumored, Caesar was advancing with 3 legions, they should offer battle. This would avoid their being forced to fight under harsher and more difficult conditions with the entire Roman army at a later date. If Caesar brought up larger forces, they would remain in the position they had already selected, and by means of traps would cut the Romans off from forage, which because of the time of year was both scanty and widely dispersed, and from corn and other supplies as well. 8. Most of the prisoners were in agreement as to the facts, and after hearing them, Caesar judged that the strategy being proposed was very cautious and far removed from the rash haste characteristic of barbarians. So he decided to attend to every matter which would tempt the enemy to despise his small numbers of men and thus give battle. He had the 7th, 8th, and 9th, all veteran legions of outstanding courage, also the 11th, a select legion of young men which showed great promise. The latter was now on its 8th campaign, but when compared with the others had yet to win a similar reputation for mature courage. Caesar called a council and explained all the facts which had been laid before him. Then he spoke words of encouragement to the men, to see if he could persuade the enemy to engage. In the belief that he had only 3 legions, he arranged the columns so that the 7th, 8th, and 9th marched ahead of all the heavy baggage. The 11th were to bring up the rear of the baggage column, which was of a moderate size, as was Caesar's custom on active operations. This would stop the enemy catching sight of an army larger than the one they had wanted. This ploy meant that his army was a virtual battle formation, and he marched it to within sight of the enemy more quickly than they had expected. 9. When the Gauls, whose confident plans had been reported to Caesar, suddenly caught sight of the legions approaching steadily as if ready for battle, they drew up their forces in front of the camp, but did not move from the higher ground. Perhaps this was because of the risks involved in engaging, or because Caesar's arrival was so sudden, or because they were waiting to see what our plan was. Caesar had been keen to engage, but was surprised by the enemy's numbers. He pitched his camp opposite that of the enemy, with a valley more deep than broad in between. He gave orders for the camp to be fortified with a 12-foot rampart, and had a parapet constructed in proportion to the rampart's height. A double ditch was dug, 15 feet wide and with perpendicular sides. 3-story towers were erected at frequent intervals, and linked by covered gangways in between. The open faces of these were protected by wicker parapets. This meant that they could ward off the enemy by means of the double ditch and a double line of defenders, the first of which could launch missiles from the gangways where height offered a greater degree of safety. The second line, stationed on the rampart and hence closer to the enemy, was protected from falling missiles by the gangways. He placed the doorways and higher towers at the gates. 10. The strategy behind this defense was twofold. First, he was hopeful that the extensive defense works and his own apparent fear would instill confidence in the enemy. Secondly, when it became necessary to go further afield in search of forage and corn, he saw that the camp could, with a small force, be protected by its own defenses. In the meantime, small numbers of men from both sides were frequently running forward between the two camps and coming into conflict across the marsh. On occasions, either our Gallic and German auxiliaries would cross the marsh and pursue the enemy fiercely, or in turn the enemy would cross instead and force our men to give way for a distance. It was inevitable, given that they were seeking it from a few scattered farms, that during the daily foraging expeditions, forage parties spread out and were surrounded in difficult locations. This inflicted insignificant losses of pack animals and slaves on our men, but it inflamed the foolish hopes of the barbarians, all the more so because Commius, who, as I explained, had set out to win reinforcements from the Germans, had arrived with some cavalry. Although these numbered no more than 500, the barbarians were still relying on the arrival of the Germans. (11) Caesar noticed that on several successive days the enemy remained in their camp, which was protected by the marsh and by the nature of its site, and he saw that the camp could not be attacked without a bloody conflict, while he would need a larger force if he was to surround the site with siege works. So he sent a letter to Trebonius telling him to summon the 13th Legion, which was wintering among the Bituriges under his legate, Titus Sextius, and thus to join him with 3 legions in all, after making his way by forced marches. Caesar himself had in turn called up a larger force of cavalry from the Remi and Lingones and other Gallic states. These he sent out to escort the forage parties so that they could withstand sudden enemy attacks. Because this took place every day and had the force of habit, the Bellovaci grew careless. This is the usual result of routine activities. After ascertaining our cavalry's daily positions and selecting a force of horsemen, they laid a trap in the woods. Next day they sent their horsemen there, first to lure our men on, then to surround them and attack. This evil fate befell the Remi, whose turn it was to carry out forage duty that day. On suddenly catching sight of the enemy cavalry, they reacted with contempt to such a small force, their own numbers being greater, pursued too eagerly, and found themselves encircled. This threw them into a panic more quickly than is usual in cavalry battles. They retreated after losing Vertiscus, who was the leader of their nation and a cavalry commander. Because of his age, this Vertiscus was scarcely able to sit astride a horse, yet in keeping with Gallic custom he had neither used his age as an excuse for avoiding the command, nor wanted the fight to go ahead without him. The enemy were fired and roused by this successful engagement and by the death of a leading citizen and commander of the Remi. But the defeat acted as a warning to our men to make their troop dispositions only after a more careful reconnaissance, and to be less hasty in pursuing the enemy. 13. Daily engagements continued within sight of both camps. These took place at the fords and shallows of the marsh. Once, during these skirmishes, the Germans, whom Caesar had brought across the Rhine to fight amongst his cavalry, with great determination crossed the marsh in a body, killed a few of the enemy who stood their ground, and pursued the rest of their army vigorously. The result was panic, not just among those who were attacked at close quarters or wounded by missiles, but even among the reserves who were some way off. They fled like cowards and did not stop running, more than once missing the chance of a better position until they were back in their camp. In some cases they were driven by such shame that they ran even further still. The whole force was in such a state of fear because of this danger that it was virtually impossible to judge which was the more disproportionate, their arrogance following an insignificant success or their panic after a slight defeat. 14. Several days had gone by in these same camps when the leader of the Bellovaci learned that Gaius Trebonius and his legions were advancing. In fear of such a siege as had taken place at Alesia, by night they sent away all the men who were too old or weak, or who had no weapons, and the rest of the heavy baggage with them. They were getting the column into order. It was in a confused muddle, for a horde of wagons usually follows the Gauls even when they are supposed to be unencumbered and ready for action. Dawn caught them unawares, however, so they drew up their armed forces in front of their camp in case the Romans should start to pursue them before the baggage train could move a significant distance forward. Because of the steepness of the climb, however, Caesar judged that they were not to be attacked if they stood their ground. At the same time, he decided that he must move up his legions to make it impossible for the barbarians to effect a safe withdrawal from their position without coming under pressure from his soldiers. He could see that the camps were separated by a marsh which would be difficult to cross, and that this would slow them down if they tried to pursue the enemy. But he noticed also that across the marsh there was a ridge reaching almost to the enemy camp, with only a shallow valley between. So he had gangways laid over the marsh, took his legions over, and quickly reached the top of the plateau on the ridge, which was protected on two sides by a downward slope. There he reformed the legions and made his way to the far end of the ridge, where he formed his battle line. From here it was possible to discharge missiles from artillery machines into the thick of the enemy. 15. Relying on the natural strength of their position, the barbarians were not averse to giving battle if the Romans should happen to attempt climbing the hill. On the other hand, they were unable to divide their forces up and send them away gradually in case they were scattered and routed, so they remained in battle formation. Caesar recognized their determination. Drawing up 20 cohorts, he measured out a camp on the spot and gave orders for its fortification. Once the works were completed, he posted the legions he had drawn up in front of the rampart and stationed his cavalry on guard posts, with their horses ready bridled. The Bellovaci saw that the Romans were prepared for pursuit, and that they could not themselves pass the night where they were without serious risk, so they settled on the following plan for withdrawal. As usual, they had an abundance of bundles of straw and twigs in camp, and they passed them from hand to hand and put them in front of their battle line. At sunset, the signal was given, and all the bundles were set alight together. The sudden blaze of fire hid their entire army from the Roman sight, at which moment the barbarians ran away with all possible speed. Mm. 16. Although the fire blocked his view of the enemy withdrawal, Caesar was none the less suspicious that it was a ruse to aid their flight. So he moved his legions up and sent out cavalry squadrons in pursuit. But he was anxious about a possible ambush in case the enemy were holding their position to entice our men onto unfavorable ground, and so he advanced with considerable caution. The cavalry were afraid to pass through the thick smoke and flame, and any who did venture forward with some eagerness could scarcely make out their own horses' heads. Their fear of a trap gave the Bellovaci an unrestricted opportunity of withdrawal. The enemy's flight was marked by fear and cunning in equal measure, and marred by no losses. They marched for less than 10 miles and then pitched camp in a place with strong defenses. From there they repeatedly set ambushes consisting of infantry and cavalry, and inflicted serious casualties on the Roman forage parties. 17. This began to happen too frequently. Caesar discovered from a prisoner that Corius, the leader of the Bellovaci, had picked out 6,000 of his best soldiers and 1,000 from his cavalry. These he was using to set a trap at a place where he suspected the Romans would be going because of the store of corn and forage there. Once he knew of the plan, Caesar led out more of the legion than usual. He sent the cavalry on ahead, which as usual acted as a guard for the forage parties, and included light armed auxiliaries among the horsemen. He himself approached as near as possible with his legions. 18. The enemy were arranged in ambush. They had selected for the action a plain which extended for no more than a mile in any direction. It was protected on every side either by woodland or by a river, which would be extremely difficult to cross. And like a cordon of huntsmen, they encircled it with ambushes. But the enemy's strategy was exposed, while our men had both weapons and spirits ready for the fight. With the legions in support, moreover, they did not refuse to engage, but advanced to the place squadron by squadron. Once they had arrived, Corius judged that he had been given his opportunity for battle. At first he appeared with a few men, and charged against the nearest squadrons. Our men held out firmly against his attack, not too many of them rushing together, for it commonly happens in cavalry battles that because of some panic, the very number of men involved causes casualties. 19. Now the squadrons were posted. It was the turn of the men to engage in small groups, to prevent their comrades being encircled on the flanks, as Corius was battling the rest of the enemy burst out of the woods. The fighting was fierce in every quarter, but when it continued inconclusively for too long, a force of infantry which was standing ready gradually emerged from the woods and forced our cavalry to give ground. Our light armed troops, however, who, as I explained, were sent ahead of the legions, swiftly came to their support. They took up positions amongst our squadrons and fought resolutely. For some time the fight was equal on both sides, but then the nature of the combat made it inevitable that those of our men who had held off the first attack began to get the upper hand in the battle. This was because they had not been so rash as to incur losses at the hands of the enemy who were lying in wait for them. Meanwhile, the legions were drawing nearer, and a flurry of reports reached both our men and the enemy simultaneously that the commander was at hand with all his forces at the ready. When they heard this, our men put their trust in the protection of the cohorts and fought more eagerly than ever to prevent the battle going on too long so that they would have to share the glory of victory with the legions. The enemy lost heart and tried to flee in all directions, to no avail. In the end, they were themselves trapped by the same natural barriers which they had hoped would cut off the Romans. They were overcome and beaten, and fled in confusion, with the loss of more than half their forces. Some made for the forest, some the river, and even these were dispatched by our men, who pursued them keenly. Corius, meanwhile, was far from crushed by this disaster, and could not be persuaded to leave the battle or take refuge in the woods, nor to take up the opportunity of surrender which we were offering. Rather, he fought with great courage and wounded many, thus provoking the anger of his conquerors and forcing them to cast their weapons against him. 20. Such was the character of the fighting. Caesar came upon the traces of battle while they were still fresh, and expected that after news of this disastrous defeat arrived, the enemy would abandon the site of their camp, which was said to be no further than about 7 miles from the scene of slaughter. He saw that the river hindered his advance, but none the less took his army across and continued his march. The Bellovaci, however, and the other Gallic peoples now suddenly had to welcome back the few fugitives and wounded men at that, who had used the woods to advantage and managed to avoid their fate. Everything was against them. They learned of the defeat, the death of Corius, and the loss of both their cavalry and the best of the infantry. When they realized that the Romans were approaching, they blew a trumpet to summon an assembly at once and sent envoys and hostages to Caesar. 21. This plan was universally approved. Commius the Atrebatian fled to the Germans, from whom he had obtained reinforcements for this campaign. The rest immediately sent envoys to Caesar and requested that he be satisfied with the punishment his enemy had suffered, a punishment which had he been in a position to inflict it on them without a fight, and while they were still unscathed, he surely would never have done so on account of his clemency and kindness. The cavalry battle, they said, had impaired the strength of the Bellovaci, and many thousands of their finest infantry had perished. Hardly anyone had survived to bring news of the slaughter. Despite the magnitude of this disaster, however, the Bellovaci had obtained one great advantage from the battle. namely, that Corius, the rabble-rousing instigator of the war, had been killed. For while he lived, the Senate had always been less in control of the state than the ignorant common people. 22. As they made their pleas, Caesar reminded the envoys of the following facts. During the previous year, the Bellovaci had undertaken the war at the same time as the other Gallic nations. They had clung to their policy more obstinately than all the rest, and had not come to their senses when all the rest surrendered. He was quite aware that it was easy to lay the blame on dead men. No one man, however, could be so powerful as to urge a war and wage it with a feeble crowd of ordinary citizens if the leaders of the state opposed it. The Senate resisted the move, and all right-thinking men obstructed it. Even so, he would be satisfied with the punishment which they had inflicted upon themselves. 23. The following night, the envoys reported his reply to their people and collected the hostages. The envoys of the other nations, which were awaiting the fate of the Bellovaci, hastily assembled. Except for Commius, who was too afraid to entrust his own safety to anyone's good faith, they gave hostages and obeyed Caesar's orders. The previous year, while Caesar was dispensing justice in near Gaul, Titus Labienus had caught Commius in the act of inciting revolt among the Gallic nations and plotting against Caesar. But he had judged that Commius's treachery could be suppressed without any breach of a safe conduct. Labienus did not believe, however, that Commius would come to his camp if summoned, and was unwilling to put him on his guard by attempting it. So he sent Gaius Volusinus Quadratus to feign interest in holding talks and have him killed, and assigned to him a picked group of centurions well fitted for the task. When the parley took place and Volusinus seized Commius by the hand as arranged, a centurion, troubled by the unusual nature of the task, perhaps, or quickly obstructed by Commius's friends, failed to finish him off. Nevertheless, he did inflict a serious wound to Commius's head with the first stroke of his sword. Then swords were drawn on both sides, but each party was more intent on flight than fight, our men in the belief that Commius had been dealt a mortal blow, and the Gauls because they saw this was a trap and were afraid that more perils awaited them than those which were apparent. After this, it was said that Commius had resolved never to come within sight of a Roman again. 24. The most warlike nations were now completely subdued, and it was evident to Caesar that there were no longer any peoples making ready for war for him to combat. Rather, a number of people were leaving the towns and fleeing their lands to avoid the power now descending upon them. He therefore decided to send the army out to different areas. He kept his quaestor, Mark Antony, and the 12th Legion at his side. He sent his legate, Gaius Fabius, with 25 cohorts to the remotest area of Gaul, because he was receiving reports that certain peoples in that region were in arms, and he thought that the 2 legions commanded by his legate Gaius Cananius Rebellius, who was present in that area, were below full strength. He summoned Titus Labienus, but sent the 15th Legion, which had been with Labienus in winter quarters, to Cisalpine Gaul, to guard the colonies of Roman citizens there. This would prevent a similar setback to that inflicted the previous summer, when the people of Tergesta had suffered a sudden assault and raid from an invasion of barbarians. Caesar himself set out to ravage and sack the territory of Ambiorix. He had given up hope of bringing Ambiorix, who was a frightened fugitive, under his control, and he considered it the next best thing for his prestige to despoil his land of its citizens, buildings, and cattle so completely that Ambiorix would come to be hated by any of his people who might chance to have survived and would be unable to return to his state because of these devastating disasters. Excuse me. 25. Caesar sent out legions or auxiliary forces to every part of Ambiorix's territory and inflicted devastation by slaughter, fire, and pillage. Large numbers of men were captured or killed. He then sent Labienus with 2 legions against the Treviri, a people who, because of their proximity to the Germans, had daily practice in warfare. They were little different from Germans in their barbarian way of life, and never followed orders unless forced to do so by an army. 26. In the meantime, the legate Gaius Caninius learned from a dispatch and messages sent by Duratius, who, despite the revolt of some of his people, had always remained a faithful friend to Romans, that a large enemy army had mustered in the territory of the Pictones. So he set out for the town of Lemanum. Got it. When he drew near to the town, he received firm reports from prisoners that Lemanum was under attack from Dumnacus, the leader of the Andes, with many thousands of men, and that Duratius was under siege. Caninius did not want to risk setting weakened legions against this enemy, but pitched camp in a secure location. When Dumnacus heard that Caninius was at hand, he shifted his entire force to face the legions and began an assault upon the Roman camp. After he had spent several days on this assault, and despite losing many of his men, had failed to undermine any part of the defenses, he returned to the siege of Lemanum. 27. At the same time, the legate Gaius Fabius was receiving several nations back under Rome's protection and confirming the arrangement by a handover of hostages. He was informed by a letter from Gaius Caninius Rebellius of what was happening among the Pictones. On receipt of this information, he set out to the assistance of Duratius. When Dumnacus heard of Fabius's approach, however, he feared for his life if forced both to withstand an external Roman enemy and at the same time to keep a nervous watch on the townspeople. So he suddenly withdrew from the place together with his forces and did not believe himself to be safe until he had got his army over the Loire, which is so wide that it must be crossed by means of a bridge. Fabius was not yet in sight of the enemy, nor had he joined forces with Caninius. Nonetheless, he received information from men who knew the area, and so the spot which he thought the enemy would most probably make for was indeed where they were headed. Fabius marched towards the same bridge with his army and ordered the cavalry to make their way in front of the legionary column, as far ahead as possible without making the horses tired when returning to the same camp at the end of the march. In accordance with these instructions, our cavalry set off in pursuit and attacked Dumnacus's column. The men they attacked on the march fled in panic, encumbered by their heavy packs. Many of them were killed, and a large amount of booty seized. After this successful engagement, the cavalry returned to camp. 28. The following night, Fabius sent the cavalry on ahead in readiness to engage and block the progress of the entire column until he caught up. In order to carry out this action, according to Fabius's orders, the cavalry officer Quintus Attius Verus, a man of exceptional courage and sound judgment, urged on his men and caught up with the enemy column. Some of his cavalry squadrons he posted at appropriate points, and with the rest he engaged in a cavalry battle. The enemy cavalry fought the more boldly because their infantry was coming up in support, halting the entire column and offering the cavalry reinforcement against our men. A fierce battle ensued. Our men despised the enemy they had beaten only the day before, and recalled that the legions were on their way in support. Both the shame of the retreat and the desire to make an end of the fight all by themselves led them to battle bravely against the enemy infantry. The enemy, on the other hand, were convinced that, as they had been informed the previous day, no more of our forces were on their way, and they seemed to have a chance of wiping out our cavalry. All right, thank you, Liz. 29. The struggle continued for some time. Dumnacus drew up his battle line to give protection in turn to his cavalry. Then suddenly the legions came into enemy view, marching in close order. The barbarian squadrons were thrown into confusion at the sight of them. The enemy line panicked, and the baggage column was in dismay. Amid shouting and disorder, they all fled. Our cavalry, however, who a moment before had been struggling against fierce resistance, were now full of elation at their success. A great shout went up. on all sides, and they surrounded the enemy in retreat. In the course of the battle, they killed as many of the enemy as the stamina of their horses for the pursuit and the strength of their hands for the slaughter would allow. More than 12,000 were killed, either armed men or men who through fear had thrown their arms away. The whole baggage train was captured. 30. After this, it became apparent that one of the Senones, a man called Drapus, had mustered no more than 2,000 men from the rout and was making for the province. Ever since Gaul first revolted, he had gathered desperate men from all around, called slaves to liberty, summoned exiles from every state, and welcomed brigands. Thus he had been able to cut off the Romans' baggage and supplies. It was also evident that Lucterius, the Catarrhan, who is known from the previous commentary to have wanted to attack the province when Gaul first revolted, was making common counsel with Drapus. The legate Caninius set out to pursue them with 2 legions to prevent harm or panic in the province, causing deep disgrace because of the depredations of these outlaws. 31. Gaius Fabius set out with the rest of the army against the Carnutes and the other states, whose armies he knew had been destroyed in the battle against Dumnacus. For he was in no doubt that they would prove to be more amenable because of this recent defeat, although given time, they could be incited if Dumnacus roused them. In the event, Fabius had extreme good luck and made good speed in recovering these states. For the Carnutes, though often under attack, had never sued for peace, but they came to surrender and give up hostages, while when Fabius and the legions arrived, the other states in the very farthest reaches of Gallic territory beside the ocean, the ones known as Aramoric, at the Carnutes' instigation, immediately bowed to his commands. Dumnacus was expelled from his own land. Skulking and wandering alone, he was forced to make for the remotest regions of Gaul. 32. When Drapus and Lucterius realized that Caninius and the legions were at hand, however, they were sure that they could not enter the province with an army in pursuit without certain destruction. Also, they had no opportunity of ranging freely and acting as outlaws, so they halted in the territory of the Carduci. Formerly, when circumstances were favorable, Lucterius had exercised considerable power among his fellow citizens, and an instigator of sedition was always influential among barbarians. With his and Drapus's armies, he seized control of Uxaladunum, a town which had once been a dependency of his and had strong natural defenses, and he joined forces with the townspeople. Excuse me. 33. Gaius Caninius speedily arrived there and observed that all areas of town were protected by sheer rock faces. Indeed, it would be difficult to climb up, even with no one defending the town. On the other hand, he could see that the townspeople had large quantities of baggage. If therefore they tried to run away secretly, taking it with them, they would find it impossible to escape not only the cavalry, but even the legions. So he divided his cohorts into 3 sections and constructed a triple camp on very high ground. From this camp, he began gradually, as much as his strength of numbers allowed, to build a rampart around the town. 34. When the townspeople saw this, they were much troubled by dreadful recollections of Alesia and feared a similar outcome to the siege. In particular, Lucterius, who had already suffered that fate, warned them to devise some strategy for the corn supply. It was unanimously decided to leave part of their army in town and take the light armed troops and set out to bring in corn. Now that this plan was approved, the following night Drapus and Lucterius left 2,000 armed men behind and led the rest out of the town. After a few days, they collected a large quantity of corn from the land of the Caduci, some of whom were happy to help supply corn, while others could not prevent their taking it. On more than one occasion, however, they made nighttime raids to attack our forts. Because of this, Gaius Caninius put off completing the encirclement of the town, in case he was either unable to defend the works when complete or obliged to post weak garrisons at too frequent intervals. 35. Now that they had plenty of corn, Drapus and Lucterius took up position no more than 10 miles from the town. From here they could convey corn on to the town a little at a time. They divided up the duties between them. Drapus remained with part of the army to guard the camp, while Lucterius took the train of pack animals to the town. He set guard posts at various points, and at around the 10th hour of the night he began to take corn into the town along narrow woodland paths. Our camp sentries heard the noise they made, and scouts were sent out who returned to report what was going on. With the armed cohorts from the nearest forts, Caninius made a swift dawn attack upon the Gauls who were transporting the corn. This sudden calamity threw them into a panic, and they fled to their guard posts. When our men caught sight of these, they were yet more fiercely roused against the enemy soldiers, and allowed none of them to be taken alive. Lucterius fled the place with a few men, and did not return to his camp. 36. Following this successful operation, Caninius learned from prisoners that part of the enemy army was encamped with Drapus, not much more than 11 miles off. Several people informed him of this fact. When he realized that one of their leaders had been routed, and that the rest of their men were terrified and could easily be subdued, he thought it a stroke of luck that no one had survived the slaughter to return to camp and bring news of the defeat to Drapus. He foresaw no danger in what he was to attempt, but still he sent on ahead all the cavalry and the German infantry, who moved with great speed to the enemy camp. Then he assigned one legion to the triple camp, and led the other out without its heavy kit. When he drew near to the enemy, he learned from the scouts he had sent on ahead that they had given up the higher ground, and that their camp, as is practically habitual among barbarians, was down by the river bank. He also heard that the cavalry and the Germans had swept down and caught them off guard and unawares, and had joined battle. On receipt of this information, he led out his legion, armed and in battle order. So it was the signal suddenly went up from every side, and the high ground was taken. Once this took place, the Germans and the cavalry battled with renewed vigor on catching sight of the legionary standards. At once the cohorts launched an assault from all quarters. The enemy was all killed or captured, and much plunder was taken. Drapus was taken prisoner in the battle. 37. Caninius had brought this engagement to a successful conclusion, and his own soldiers were virtually unscathed. He then went back to continue besieging the townspeople. The enemy outside had been destroyed. It was in fear of them that Caninius had been prevented from dividing up his garrisons and encircling the townspeople, so now he gave orders for the work to be set in train at every point. Next day, Gaius Fabius arrived with his army and took part of the town to blockade it. Excuse me. 38. In the meantime, Caesar left his quaestor Mark Antony with 15 cohorts in the land of the Bellovaci, so that the Belgae would not have an opportunity of planning some fresh revolt. He himself approached the other peoples. He demanded more hostages, and as they were all in a panic, he gave them reassurance. When he came to the Carnutes, the people among whom the war began, as Caesar explained in the previous commentary, he could see that their guilt was making them particularly nervous. So as to allay their fears, the more swiftly he demanded for punishment Gutrater, the ringleader in the plot and instigator of the war. Although Gutrater did not entrust his safety even to his fellow citizens, nevertheless they all did their best to seek him out, and he was taken to Caesar's camp. Strong pressure from his soldiers forced Caesar to punish Gutrater against the bias of his own inclination. They blamed him for all the dangers and losses they had suffered in the war, so he was beaten to death and then decapitated. 39. A number of dispatches from Caninius then informed Caesar of what had happened to Drapus and Lucterius, and of the resolution with which the townspeople were holding out. Even though he scorned them because of their small numbers, he judged it necessary to punish their obstinacy severely. He had to prevent the whole of Gaul thinking it was resolution rather than sufficient strength that it lacked for resisting the Romans, and he must also stop other peoples following this example and making the most of their advantageous positions to win their liberty. He was aware that all the Gauls knew that his command was due to last for only one more campaign season. If they could endure this, they would have no more threat to fear. For the reason Caesar left his legate Quintus Calenus with 2 legions to follow him by regular marches. He himself set out at top speed with all the cavalry to join Calenus. 40. Contrary to everyone's expectation, Caesar arrived at Excelladunum. He observed that the town was enclosed by siege works and that it was impossible to draw back from the siege under any circumstances. He also learned from deserters that the townspeople had plentiful supplies of corn, so he began to try and cut off the enemy's water. A river ran along the bottom of the valley, which was almost surrounded the hill on which the town of Uxalladunum, with its sheer sides, was situated. The nature of the ground meant that diverting the stream was impossible, for the way it flowed at the foot of the hill meant that its course could not be deflected by digging channels. On the other hand, for the townspeople, the way down to the river was steep and difficult. If our soldiers stood in their way, they could not reach the river and make their way back up the steep climb unscathed without risking their lives. Caesar perceived their difficulty and posted archers and slingers. He also set up artillery at certain points to face the easiest downward paths. In this way, he deprived the townspeople of water. Ave Bon. 41. All the townspeople in a body came together to get water at a single point beneath the town wall. There a large spring gushed out, and there was a space of about 300 feet where the river did not encircle the town. Although everyone else was hopeful that the townspeople could be cut off from their spring, Caesar alone saw how to bring it about. He began to bring up movable shelters facing the place and opposite the hill, and constructed an earthwork with great effort and amid constant fighting. The townspeople ran down from their vantage point, engaging at long range and at no risk to themselves, and wounding many of our men as they doggedly made their way up. Yet our men were not deterred from bringing the shelters forward, and their struggles and hard work overcame the difficulties of their position. At the same time, they were bringing mine tunnels forward to the water channels and the head of the spring, and this action was able to proceed without risk and without arousing the enemy's suspicions. The earthwork was built up to a height of 60 feet and a 10-story tower placed upon it. This was not intended to equal the height of the wall, an aim impossible to achieve, but rather to reach above the height of the spring. Catapults discharged missiles at the approach to the spring, and the townspeople could not fetch water safely. The result was that not only the cattle and pack animals, but also all the enemy were consumed by thirst. 42. This affliction threw the townspeople into a panic. They filled casks with tallow, pitch, and shingle, which they set alight and poured to the siege works. At the same time, they fought with extreme ferocity, so that the threat posed by battle would deter the Romans from putting out the fire. Suddenly a blaze broke out on the siege works, for every missile discharged down the steep incline stuck fast in the shelters, and the earthwork and ignited whatever stood in its way. On the other hand, although our soldiers were under pressure because of this dangerous style of fighting and their difficult position, they nonetheless stood their ground with exceptional courage. This action took place on high ground and in sight of our army, and a loud shout went up on both sides. Thus each man tried his best to be noticed and to have his courage marked and witnessed by exposing himself to the missiles and fires of the enemy. 43. Caesar saw that a number of his men were wounded. He ordered the cohorts to climb the hill on every side of the town, and while pretending to attack the walls, to raise a shout all around. This action terrified the townspeople. As they were in doubt as to what was happening elsewhere, they recalled their soldiers from the attack on the siege works and stationed them on the walls. In this way our men ended the battle and either put out the fires on the siege works or cut away the parts which were burning. The townspeople continued to put up strong resistance, and, despite the fact that many of them had died of thirst, they persisted in their intention. Yet in the end the mines enabled us to cut off and divert the channel of the spring. This act caused the spring, which had never yet failed, to dry up. The townspeople now lost all hope of saving themselves, and believed that this had happened not through human stratagem, but by the will of the gods. Thus they were forced of necessity to surrender. 44. Caesar knew that his leniency was universally known, and so he was not afraid that if he acted somewhat harshly, he would appear to have done so out of innate cruelty. Nor indeed could he foresee any successful outcome of his strategies if more of the enemy in other areas acted similarly in adopting such a course. For this reason he decided upon making an example of the townspeople and punishing them, so as to deter the rest. He allowed them to live, therefore, but cut off the hands of all those who had carried arms against him. This was made the punishment for wrongdoers plain to see. Grapus, who, as I explained, had been captured by Caninius, refused food for a number of days and so died, either because of the shame and grief of being held in chains or in fear of a more severe punishment. At the same time, Lucterius, who, as I described, had escaped from the battle, fell into the power of an Arvernian called Epesnactus. Lucterius was unable to spend too long in any one place, and frequently changing location, was obliged to entrust his personal safety to the good faith of many. For he was aware of what an enemy he must have in Caesar. This Arvernian Epesnactus, who was a loyal friend of the Roman people, bound Lucterius in chains and sent him to Caesar without hesitation. 45. Meanwhile, Labienus fought a successful cavalry engagement in the land of the Treveri, and killed some of the Treveri and a number of Germans, who never refused to help anyone fighting the Romans. Their leaders he took alive and subdued. Among them was an Aeduan called Surus, a man of distinction in both courage and lineage, who alone of the Aedui had still remained ready to fight. Almost done. 46. On learning of this, Caesar observed that operations in every part of Gaul were going on well, and he judged that Gaul had now been conquered and humbled by the campaigns of previous seasons. He had, however, never been to Aquitania in person, but had conquered part of it through Publius Crassus. He therefore set out for that region to spend the final part of his campaign season there. This action was as swiftly and successfully completed as all the rest had been, for all the Aquitanian peoples sent Caesar envoys and surrendered hostages to him. After this, he set out for Narbo with the cavalry as escort. He had his legates settle the army in the winter quarters. 4 legions he posted in Belgium under the legates Mark Antony, Gaius Trebonius, and Publius Vatinius. 2 he sent to the Aedui, whose influence in all Gaul he knew to be preeminent. 2 he posted among the Turones, on the Carnutes borders, to exercise control over the whole of the region which borders the ocean. The remaining 2 went to the lands of the Lemovices, close to the Arverni. Thus no area of Gaul was free from his army's presence. He lingered in the province for a few days, hastening through all the assize towns, hearing public disputes and distributing rewards to those who deserved them. For he had an excellent opportunity of learning what had been each person's attitude to the Gallic revolt, a revolt which he had withstood because of the loyal assistance given by the province. These affairs settled, he withdrew to the legions in Belgium, and wintered at Nemetacina. 47. There he learned how Commius the Atrebatian had clashed in battle with Roman cavalry. Antony had reached winter quarters and found the Atrebates staying loyal, but Commius, after being wounded as I related earlier, had habitually kept himself in readiness for any disturbance among his fellow citizens, so that when they took for a plan of campaign, a leader and commander would not be lacking. Now that the Atrebates were in subjection to the Romans, he supported himself and his followers by using his cavalry for raids. By lying in wait along the roads, he intercepted a number of supply convoys, which were on their way to the Romans' winter camp. 48. Gaius Volsinius Quadratus had been assigned to Antony as cavalry officer to winter with him. Antony sent him in pursuit of the enemy cavalry. Volsinius combined with his exceptional courage a great hatred of Commius, so he was all the more glad to carry out the orders. He set up the ambushes, attacked Commius's cavalry, and won his engagements. At last, in an encounter somewhat fiercer than usual, his eagerness to intercept Commius himself enticed Volsinius into pursuing him too tenaciously with only a few men. In his impetuous flight, his enemy Commius had drawn Volsinius on too far, and now suddenly called upon the loyal assistance of his men not to allow the wounds treacherously inflicted on him to stay unpunished. Leaving the rest behind, Commius turned his horse and recklessly charged towards Volsinius. All his cavalry followed, turning our small force and chasing after it. Commius spurred on his horse and drew level with Volsinius's mount, then pointed his spear and thrust it with all his might through Volsinius's thigh. Now that the Roman commander had been wounded, our men did not hesitate. They stood their ground, then turned their horses and routed the enemy. When this happened, several of the enemy were struck and wounded by the force of our attack. Some were trampled as they fled, others trapped. Commius escaped his fate thanks to the speed of his horse, but despite winning the battle, Volsinius was badly hurt and was taken back to camp, apparently in danger of his life. Perhaps Commius's sense of grievance was now satisfied, or perhaps he had lost too many men. But he now sent envoys to Antony and surrendered hostages, promising to remain where he was told to stay and to do as he was ordered. He begged for one concession to his fear, not to be obliged to come within sight of any Roman. Antony judged that his request sprang from a legitimate fear, so he pardoned him and requested and accepted the hostages. I am well aware that Caesar composed a separate commentary for each year, but I have decided not to follow his example because of the following year the consulship of Lucius Paulus and Gaius Marcellus, no action of any significance took place in Gaul. Nevertheless, to avoid any remaining ignorant of where Caesar and his army were at the time, I have decided to write a brief addition to this commentary. 49. When Caesar was wintering in Belgium, his one intention was to maintain friendly relations with the peoples there. Let me see. And to give no one a hope or motive for starting hostilities. There was nothing he wanted less than to find himself obliged to fight another war just as he was about to depart from his province. There was a danger that if the army had to withdraw, it would leave behind a war which the whole of Gaul could join in without immediate risk. So he addressed the people with respect, made generous payments to their leaders, and imposed no new burdens, and by these means he easily kept the Gauls subdued and more obedient, for they were exhausted by their many defeats. 50. Once winter was past, and a change from his usual practice, Caesar set out at top speed for Italy to address the communities and colonies. He had already recommended to them the candidature of his quaestor Mark Antony for a priesthood. On behalf of so close a friend, whom he had sent on ahead to pursue his candidature, he exercised his influence gladly, and also eagerly to combat the factional power of a few men who wanted to defeat Antony in order to overthrow Caesar's influence when he left his province. Excuse me. Although Caesar heard in the course of his march that Antony had been made augur before he reached Italy, he thought there was still good reason for visiting the communities and colonies to thank them for offering Antony their full support. He also wanted to commend his own candidature for office in the following year, His enemies were gloating arrogantly at the election of Lucius Lentulus and Gaius Marcellus as consuls, for they would strip Caesar of his office and prestige. The office of consul had been wrested from Servius Galba, despite his greater popularity and larger number of votes, because he was a friend of Caesar and one of his legates. 51. Caesar's arrival was greeted by all the communities and colonies with incredible respect and affection, for he was visiting for the first time following the war against the whole of Gaul. In decorating gates, roads, and all the places Caesar was to pass through, nothing they could think of was left undone. All the people came with their children to see him. Animals were sacrificed everywhere. The marketplaces and temples were full of dining couches, as it were in anticipation of the happiness of a triumph so long expected. Such was the splendid generosity of the richer people and the eager enthusiasm of the more humble. 52. When Caesar had sped through all the districts of Cisalpine Gaul, he quickly returned to his army at Nemetacena, summoned the legions from winter quarters to the lands of the Treviri, then set out for the same place himself. On arrival, he conducted a review of his army. He put Titus Labienus in charge of Cisalpine Gaul, so that his recommendation could reinforce their support for his candidature for the consulship. He himself undertook as much marching as he judged, by effecting a change of location necessary for the health and well-being of his men. During these marches, Caesar was receiving frequent reports that his personal enemies were trying to win Labienus over, and he was informed that this was being done on the advice of a few men with the intention of using a resolution of the Senate to deprive him of part of his army. But Caesar did not believe any of the rumors about Labienus, nor could he be induced to do anything to oppose a resolution of the Senate, for he judged that his cause would easily prevail among the senators if they declared their opinions freely. For when Gaius Curio, who was a tribune of the people, had undertaken to defend Caesar's cause and his prestige, he had often made a promise to the Senate. Since Pompey's armed tyranny was inflicting no small degree of panic in the forum, if anyone was troubled by fear of Caesar's arms, Curio proposed that both men should give up their arms and disband their armies. Such an act would make the Roman state free and autonomous. This was no empty promise, for Curio even tried to obtain a decree of the Senate by bringing it to a vote. The consuls and Pompey's friends prevented this happening. By delaying the matter, they ensured its failure. 53. This was a strong indicator of the attitude of the Senate as a whole, and accorded with its earlier action. For the previous year, when Marcellus was attacking Caesar's prestige, he had brought the matter of Caesar's provinces before the Senate prematurely, in contravention of a law of Pompey and Crassus. After the senators' opinions were expressed, Marcellus brought it to a vote. He was looking for any prestige to be won from envy of Caesar. But the whole Senate together voted against his motion. Caesar's enemies were not discouraged by these setbacks, but they were made aware of the need for more favorable circumstances in which the Senate could be forced to give its approval to their decisions. 54. A decree of the Senate then followed, to the effect that Pompey and Caesar should each send one legion for the Parthian War. Evidently, one man was to be deprived of 2 legions, for Pompey had sent him the first legion, a legion levied in Caesar's own province, and had handed it over to be, in effect, Caesar's own. Although there was scarcely a doubt of his enemy's intentions, nevertheless Caesar sent the legion back to Pompey. For his own part, he ordered the 15th, which he had kept in Near Gaul, to be handed over in accordance with their senatorial decree. He sent the 13th legion to Italy, in its place to maintain the garrisons from which the 15th was being withdrawn. He arranged winter quarters for the army, posting Gaius Trebonius to Belgium with 4 legions, and sending Gaius Fabius with the same number to the Aedui. This he believed would ensure Gaul was as secure as possible. If the Belgae, preeminent in courage, and the Aedui, preeminent in influence, were under the control of armies, Caesar then set out for Italy. 55. When he arrived, he found that, thanks to Consul Gaius Marcellus, the 2 legions which he had sent back, and which were destined in accordance with a senatorial decree for the Parthian War, had been handed over to Pompey and were being kept back in Italy. After this, there was no doubt of what was being planned against Caesar, yet Caesar decided that he must endure it all. so long as he still had some hope of deciding the issue according to law rather than by fighting it out. And that is the end of the Gallic War. So, let's see. Get this out. That should be it for today. And luckily it was short because we're getting a bit sore. And I did today because tomorrow I work. So I won't read probably till next Monday. And we'll be using the Malleus Maleficorum, the Low Witch's Hammer. Should be fun. So until then, thanks for hanging. Thanks for listening. Oh, thank you, Bon. And be here next Monday with the Malleus Maleficorum, the beginning of it. So, I'll see you later. Bye.